Hey y'all, welcome back. In this video, we're going to spend some time talking a little bit about ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and also toward the end involve sort of a brief discussion, especially as they relate to ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, just the other conditions that are part of the class of neurodevelopmental disorders, especially when it comes to intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder, as well as communication disorders, specific learning disorders, and things of that nature. And I hope that this was the case for the video we just had about autism spectrum disorder. But what I'm trying to do here, to a certain degree, is to put some, or just personalize, put some flesh on the skeleton that you're reading about when you cover your reading in the DSM. So in order to do that, I'm going to, perhaps do this thing that's somewhat taboo in the academic world. I'm going to show you a video of what's real in my own life, and it involves my kids. You're going to see, and I'm going to share my screen with you now. You're going to see what I find to be a fantastic and hilarious video of primarily Alice Shepherd and her older sister, Emily. She's 2 years older, will be featured. This will help guide our discussion of ADHD, and I hope you'll see why in just a second. Just keep in mind, this is a video that was recorded by my wife, also a mental health professional, Nicole, or Nikki Shepherd, on Halloween of 2021. So I will introduce you to Alice now.
You can take a spot. Yeah, I can take his spot. So you'll be in December. Yeah, when I'm 6. Because I've been. You will be 3 this December. The next summer I'll be 4, but then I'll be 5. Which is so much like you, girl. And that's no doubt. Oh, I got hot. Every day, go to church, and I've been to church, and listen to music, and talk about stories, and ballet, dancing, I can't be babies.
We can, let me see. Oh.
All right, so hopefully that's self-explanatory why we're using it as a sort of an example of what is possible with ADHD. Now, let's talk about some of the major criticisms of ADHD. As we do that, I tried to minimize my screen, cannot do that, just bear with me. One of the primary criticisms of ADHD, especially in the updated version from DSM-4-TR to DSM-5, was that the criteria were expanded, and the critics of the disorder in its current form were concerned that what would be developmentally appropriate behavior would be pathologized. And so that's a very important piece of skillfully assessing and diagnosing ADHD in all of its forms across the lifespan, is to just be very clear about what is within developmentally expected ranges for behavior, and applying that to the client that you're working with. So keep in mind that ADHD primarily is a persistent, it sort of is manifested by a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity that interferes with functioning and development, as characterized by one and or a second sort of major criteria. And that first criteria is inattention. The second criteria is hyperactivity or impulsivity. That is difficulties with impulse control. Now, for a diagnosis of ADHD, primarily, well, we'll talk about the different types in just a second, but the inattention side of things, there are 9 different subcriteria that are possible signs of ADHD level inattention. A person must exhibit 6 or more of these that before the age of 17, and after the age of 17, 5 or more. And these sort of criteria must be manifestations of behavior that are inconsistent with the client's developmental level, and must not be primarily a manifestation or solely a manifestation of oppositional behavior, defiance, hostility, or failure to understand. So it's really important to rule out physical concerns such as maybe impairments to hearing, or if there's some type of intellectual concern, maybe there's a comprehension problem that is perhaps that better explains the criteria. So as you'll remember from your reading, these inattention criteria include failure to give close attention to tasks or play activities. These are sort of details and accuracy problems. There's difficulty with sustaining attention. There is difficulty with, or at least the client does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Oftentimes the client does not follow through with instructions. They may start a task very quickly, but then they lose focus and or change attention to a different activity or task. The client may often have difficulty organizing tasks or activities. This oftentimes in school age clients can manifest as sort of like a backpack that looks like an explosion happened in it. Lots of disorganized and crumpled and maybe even dirty items in the backpack. Number 6, there's an avoidance of tasks that require sustained attention. There's a tendency to lose things that are necessary for tasks and activities. People may be easily distracted by extraneous stimuli or forgetful in daily activities. Now, the odds are very good that any one of us watching this video right now exhibit multiple signs of this inattention on a consistent basis. And sometimes these things can lead to sort of beautiful experiences. So, as we saw the song that Alice was singing, super high energy, even late at night. And you might argue that she is easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. So let's flip it to the morning. It is fairly common that as we are walking out the door to get in the car to go to preschool, Alice will be easily distracted by maybe some type of animal, or oftentimes she'll see a snail or a slug or something like that in the yard and be drawn to it. And at times like this, and at other times too, she can exhibit sort of a sense that she is not attending to her mother, myself, a teacher, when she's being directly spoken to. And usually it's because she's focused on something else entirely. Now, again, 6 or more for a person under the age of 17 and 5 or more for a person older than 17 must be present to meet criteria for ADHD. Now, the second criteria of hyperactivity or impulsivity, or in other words, difficulties with impulse control, 6 or more of these following criteria must be present for more than 6 months, and again, inconsistent with developmental level and not better explained by sort of oppositional or defiant or behavior or some other type of difficulty like a failure to understand. These criteria include 9 different symptoms. So a person may often fidget or tap hands or feet or squirm. They may leave their seat when they are expected to sit in their environment. They may run about or climb at inappropriate times. They may be unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly. They may be often on the go. I think Alice certainly would check this box. People that are dealing with the hyperactivity, impulsivity side of things with ADHD may talk excessively. They may blurt out answers before questions or prompts or instructions are completed. They may have great difficulty waiting their turn, and they may interrupt or intrude upon the conversation or the activity of others. Now, again, coming back to sort of the developmental level. So these criteria, whether they are 6 or more or not, to meet criteria for ADHD, they must be inconsistent with the developmental level. And so at the time of the recording of this video, Alice is 3 years old. She turned 3 in August of 2021. And so there are questions need to be asked about, is this more or less typical 3-year-old behavior? One of the things that I think can be problematic, and that I as a father and a clinician have encountered, especially in regard to Alice, is she is often being viewed in the context of her older sister, who, as you could tell, is much more measured, has a different pace, and is often much more clear with her behavior and her speech. But that's not fair to the sibling, in this case Alice, because Emily is a very specific child, and Alice's behavior must be viewed in the larger context of what we understand about human development generally. So just keep that in mind when you're considering diagnosis for perhaps a child like Alice or a child of any other age. It's also important to have an in-depth understanding of the patterns of criteria as much as possible, due to the possibility that there is some other etiology or origin of the symptom. So one of the things that I think is super problematic about ADHD is that oftentimes people in power positions, whether it be parents or teachers or administrators or whatever the case may be, are vulnerable to misinterpreting the behavior as defiant. And so it's important to have a strong grasp of other environmental and systemic factors affecting the child. It is possible that the behavior that the child is exhibiting is some type of what I would consider to be protest behavior. Some people call it defiance. I would call it protest. We will get into that in a little more detail when we start getting into other types of sort of depressive and or disruptive and impulse control diagnoses and disorders. Also, I think it's important to recognize that, and I think your DSM gets into this a little bit when it comes to differential diagnosis. Oftentimes the inattentive symptoms can be better explained by the hypervigilance related to the experience of trauma. So again, before we take a direction of ADHD, it's very important to rule out trauma in the client's history. Oftentimes, if a child, especially in elementary school, is having great difficulty sitting still or attending to and completing tasks, sort of the surface level stuff is inattention and hyperactivity. So it's important for folks in a school setting or even in a clinical setting working with a school-aged child to rule out trauma, because if you go with a diagnosis of ADHD, but there is trauma in the child's history, the child becomes vulnerable to being medicated in ways that stimulate the brain with Ritalin, Concerta, Adderall, whatever the case may be. And that could exacerbate hypervigilance. So it's important to kind of rule that out so that you can have an accurate sort of treatment plan. And beyond all of that, there must be clear evidence that the criteria that are met for ADHD interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or other important areas of functioning. Again, that goes back to behavioral functioning, emotional regulation, and thinking patterns, cognitive functioning. I think it's also important for us to, as clinicians, to consider in the event that a child meets these criteria, who needs to change? Is it the child that needs to change? Or is it possible that it is the environment that is exacerbating these developmentally appropriate responses to stimuli in the environment, and perhaps the environment needs to change? So I'll give you another example that involves Alice. So one of the things that we have been working on at our house is, as this video demonstrates, sort of adjusting the bedtime routine to facilitate the calming down of the body and the going to sleep of our children, for obvious reasons. We want them to be healthy, we want them to get enough sleep. We want them to have all the benefits of sleep, including, sort of brain and body growth and things of that nature. And let's be frank, Nikki and I would like, maybe an hour of quiet time at the house before we ourselves go off to bed. So one of the things that Alice has really taken to are more concrete interventions. In this case, we've used sort of a token system that she has really taken to. This is a simple, concrete sort of system where Alice has a certain number of quote unquote tickets that she can exchange. And if she has so many tickets left over at the end of the week, then she can exchange that for some type of treat. And that seems to have been concrete and simple and immediate enough for her 3-year-old mind to grasp. And she has responded beautifully to it. I think it's important to find ways to reframe, to avoid assigning sort of malicious intent, especially when you're working with a child as young as Alice, or even in elementary school, and to find kind of what the strengths are, what is enjoyable about this child, what is sort of a developmental problem, and also what is just a expression of a person's personality. There is so much that Alice's mother and I would miss if we did not sort of flow with her sort of attention, being drawn by what we would think of as extraneous stimuli. Like, we're focused on, we have to get to school on time, or they're not going to let her into school, and then we have a huge disruption in our day. I think it's important for us to reprioritize the needs, and to find ways to work with Alice's energy in order to help her to have developmentally appropriate, functioning, and enjoyable life that sort of appreciates her energy and her joy and her interests, rather than putting them down or squelching them. So I say all that to say, we have to be extraordinarily careful, especially when it comes to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because there is such a strong tendency in our sort of common discourse outside of the clinical setting, even among sort of allied professions, that are prioritizing the needs of the environment and the people in power over the developmental needs of a child or another person who may be in sort of a one-down position. So as you're thinking about sort of diagnosing a problem, be thinking about, first of all, do they meet all the criteria? Because it's a substantial sort of series of behavioral manifestations that are required to meet criteria for ADHD, even if it's just one of the specific types, like inattentive type or hyperactive type, or and so it's also important to just recognize are the signs and symptoms sort of themselves leading to impairment or sort of diminishment of functioning across social, occupational, academic, and other types of functioning? Or can the functioning be supported by a change in the environment rather than sort of a change in the child? Perhaps the child is just expressing their personality. Perhaps the child is acting in developmentally appropriate ways. And then it is incumbent upon us to use really the least restrictive conditions to provide sort of the guidance and the boundaries in the environment that will support the child's development. Oftentimes, when that is the case, the symptoms that may have looked like ADHD will sort of resolve over time, because the child's development catches up with what's expected in their environment, and they thrive as is without additional support. So I think it's also important to recognize that just like I referred to in the video about autism spectrum disorder, oftentimes neurodevelopmental disorders, including ADHD, are signs of what people are now describing as neurodiversity, sort of naturally occurring, having always been or for a very long time being present, sort of styles of neurological expression that are not problematic in and of themselves. In fact, they are needed and necessary in our society to support growth. And and just appreciate the beauty that is the spectrum and the prism of human identity and existence and expression. It's also important to note that oftentimes if you're working with or experiencing a child that may have attention or hyperactivity concerns, there is likely to be some other sort of adjacent manifestation of a neurodevelopmental disorder. For example, one of the things that we're noticing with Alice is that as she's starting to read, she is picking up on words and kind of essentially what she's doing is she's reading from right to left. And so we are at least clued into the possibility that she may be exhibiting signs of a specific learning disorder, in this case, dyslexia. She has an uncle, maybe two uncles, now that I think about it, that may have had that sort of early developmental manifestation of a specific learning disorder in early childhood that went undiagnosed and led to meaningful difficulties in their academic functioning. So we're keeping an eye on that. And at the same time, she's 3. It may resolve by the time she gets to kindergarten. And so, yeah, I think when we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, if we can focus on or prioritize depathologizing what's going on, normalizing what's going on, and giving parents and other adults the tools that they need to effectively and supportively intervene, then the impairments to functioning are much more unlikely. And the need to add additional chemicals to the brain may also be unnecessary. So again, just like with autism spectrum disorder, there may be additional adjacent sort of signs of a specific learning disorder, communication disorder, for people who are presenting with more prominent signs of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And oftentimes if we can identify those and treat those, then the functioning improves dramatically. So yeah, it's also important to be careful about getting distracted by the things that feel disruptive to the world that is built for more typically developing folks. So I'm interested again to hear about your comments, concerns, and other questions that maybe this video sort of sparked in you, but also maybe also come from the reading that you've done or other personal experience. This concludes our videos, or at least our video on ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Yeah, I look forward to addressing further concerns and questions on the discussion board. I'll see you over there. Thanks.